The cold hit hard the moment Wesley pushed open the door of Maple Run Café. Not the polite chill of autumn. The kind that gets into your bones and stays there. The kind that follows a man home from 3 deployments and never quite leaves. He stood in the doorway for exactly 2 seconds, old habit. Scan the room, count the exits. Note who's sitting with their back to the wall and who isn't. Force of habit. He was on leave. He wasn't supposed to be doing that anymore. Beside him, Kodak sat perfectly still. 90 pounds of German Shepherd, coal-black saddle, amber eyes that missed nothing. Kodak didn't fidget, didn't whine, didn't pull at the leash. He just waited, the way he always waited, calm as still water, coiled as a spring. Wesley stepped inside. Kodak followed. The cafe smelled like maple syrup and coffee, and something frying in the back. Country music played low from somewhere above the counter. A few booths along the window, a handful of tables in the middle. A long counter with red vinyl stools, half full on a Tuesday morning. Mostly older folks, a couple of young moms with strollers, a man reading a newspaper with his glasses pushed too far down his nose. It was the kind of place that reminded Wesley of home. Before everything, he found a booth in the back corner, slid in. Kodak settled under the table without being asked, nose between his paws, eyes still moving. A waitress appeared, mid-50s, silver hair pulled back, the kind of face that had probably smiled 10,000 cups of coffee into existence. "Morning," she said. "Just the 2 of you?" "Yes, ma'am." She glanced down at Kodak. "Service dog?" "Military working dog. On leave with me." She smiled the way people smile when they mean it. "What can I get you?" "Black coffee, whatever the special is. Bacon and eggs with home fries. Best in Ridgewood, that'll do." She disappeared. Wesley looked out the window. The main street of Ridgewood, Ontario, was quiet in the way small towns are always quiet. Not empty, just unhurried. A woman walked a golden retriever past the hardware store. A kid on a bicycle cut through the crosswalk without stopping. He exhaled slowly. His shoulders dropped half an inch. Kodak's nose twitched, Wesley noticed. He always noticed when Kodak's nose twitched. But the dog settled again. Wesley let it go. The coffee arrived. It was good. Not the burnt-tasting thing you get at highway stops, but real coffee, brewed by someone who cared. Wesley wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at the table, and thought about nothing in particular, which was the closest he ever got to rest. That was when the door opened and the noise came in with it. Not loud noise. The kind that changes the air. The kind you feel before you hear. The man who walked in wore a manager's polo shirt, navy blue with a small Maple Run logo over the breast pocket. He was somewhere in his 40s, broad-shouldered, thick around the middle, with the particular expression of a man who has never once doubted himself in his life. His name tag read Gielan. He stopped 6 feet from Wesley's booth. He looked at Kodak. He looked at Wesley. His expression did something complicated. "Excuse me." Glenn's voice was the voice of a man who had practiced being in charge. "Is that animal yours?" "He is." "This is a food establishment. I know. Animals aren't permitted in food establishments. That's provincial health code." Wesley didn't look up from his coffee. "He's a certified military working dog. Canadian Food Inspection Regulations, Section 31. Service animals are permitted." Glenn's jaw moved. He hadn't expected that. "He doesn't look like a service animal." "What does a service animal look like, Glenn?" The use of his name made Glenn blink. People in authority don't like it when you use their name calmly. It takes something from them. "He doesn't have a vest," Glenn said. "He's on leave. Same as me." A couple of heads turned. An older man at the counter, maybe 70, plaid jacket, coffee going cold, had stopped pretending to look at his phone. Glenn straightened up. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to remove the animal, or remove yourself from the premises." Wesley looked up then. He looked at Glenn for a long moment. Not challenging, not aggressive. Just steady, the way a wall is steady. "I'm going to finish my coffee," Wesley said. "Then I'm going to eat my breakfast. Then I'm going to leave." "Sir, I'm not a threat to your customers, Glenn. Neither is Kodak. That's not your call to make." "You're right," Wesley said. "It's yours, and you're making the wrong one." Something flickered across Glenn's face, not doubt, not yet. Just a crack in the certainty, too small for him to notice. He turned and walked back toward the counter. He picked up the phone behind the register. Wesley watched him dial. Kodak's nose twitched again. The officer arrived 8 minutes later. There are moments, and anyone who's lived enough of life knows them, when you can feel a situation tilting. When something that should be simple becomes complicated not because of what it is, but because of who's in it. Wesley felt the tilt the moment the officer walked through the door. Not because the officer looked dangerous. He didn't. He was maybe 32, trim, clean uniform. The slightly self-conscious posture of someone who hasn't been doing this long enough to wear it naturally. His name tag said Brock. He looked at Glenn. Glenn pointed at Wesley. Brock walked over. "Good morning." His voice was careful, practiced. "Sir, I've received a complaint about an unregistered animal on the premises." "He's not unregistered. He's a certified military working dog, HMW classification, handler qualified, trained by the Canadian Forces." Brock looked at Kodak. Kodak looked back at Brock with the patience of something much older than either of them. "Do you have documentation?" "In my bag." Wesley started to reach for it. "Actually, sir, I need you to keep your hands where I can see them while we sort this out." Wesley went still. His hands stayed on the table. His expression didn't change. "I wasn't reaching for anything threatening. I understand that, sir. But until I know what's going on here, I need you to stay calm." "I am calm." Brock looked at him, then at Kodak, then at Glenn, who was standing at the counter with his arms crossed, nodding slightly, the way people nod when they feel vindicated. "Sir, the owner of this establishment has the right to refuse service the manager," Wesley said quietly. "I'm sorry, he's the manager, not the owner. The owner's name is Patricia Holt. She's been running this place for 22 years. Glenn started 8 months ago." Brock blinked. Glenn's face did something it probably hadn't done in years. It faltered. The older man at the counter made a sound. Not quite a laugh. Somewhere between recognition and satisfaction. Brock looked at his notepad. He looked at Wesley. He looked at the dog. "Sir, I still need to ask you to come outside with me while we get this straightened out. I've done nothing wrong, I understand." "But Kodak," Wesley said. "Stay." He stood up. He was not a large man, not the way action movies would have you believe. He was lean and quiet, and he moved the way people move when they've learned to make as little noise as possible in places where noise gets people killed. He followed Brock toward the door. Glenn watched with the expression of a man who thinks he's won something. He hadn't noticed what Kodak was doing. Under the table, alone now, Kodak lifted his nose. He wasn't looking for Wesley. He knew exactly where Wesley was. He could track Wesley's scent in a crowd of 1,000. He was looking for something else. Something had changed in the air of the cafe in the last 4 minutes. Something chemical, sharp underneath the maple syrup and frying butter and old coffee. Kodak knew this smell. He had trained for it in a warehouse in Petawawa, surrounded by fake walls and buried boxes and patient instructors who rewarded him not with force but with joy. He knew what this smell meant. He stood up slowly. No bark, no growl. He moved the way he'd been trained to move. Controlled, deliberate, without wasted energy. He walked from the booth toward the far wall where the old jukebox sat, and the plastic bins for recycling lined up next to the radiator. He sat down in front of a black canvas bag wedged behind the recycling bin. He sat very still. He looked at the door where Wesley had gone. Outside, Brock was mid-sentence when the older man from the counter appeared in the doorway. Plaid jacket. White hair. The face of someone who had spent a lifetime not saying things and had decided this wasn't going to be one of those times. "Officer." His voice was the voice of the prairies. Flat and direct and not interested in argument. "You should come inside, sir. I'm in the middle of. The dog is sitting in front of something." Brock stopped. Wesley turned. The older man, his name was Howard, And he'd been coming to Maple Run Café every Tuesday for 11 years, held the door open with one hand, and looked at Wesley with the expression of someone who has watched enough of life to recognize when something real is happening. "Your dog," Howard said, "found something." Wesley was already moving. He came through the door first. Brock was a step behind him. Glenn looked up from behind the counter, with the expression of a man preparing to say something about protocols. He didn't get the chance. Kodak was sitting in front of the recycling bin. Still, perfect. The position Wesley recognized from every single training exercise, from Petawawa to 3 different countries whose names he couldn't say in polite company. Passive alert, controlled, certain. Wesley crossed the cafe in 4 steps. He crouched down next to Kodak. He didn't reach for the bag. He looked at it. He looked at Kodak. "Show me," he said quietly. Kodak touched his nose to the side of the black canvas bag. Wesley stood up. He turned to Brock. "You need to call your EOD unit right now." Brock stared at him. "The Explosive Ordnance Disposal Unit," Wesley said. "Whatever Ridgewood has access to. Call them now. Then you need to start clearing this building." The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Glenn broke it. "This is completely, Glenn." Wesley's voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. "Sit down and do not touch anything." Something in the room shifted. The air changed. Not like before, not with chemical sharpness, but with the particular tension that happens when people suddenly understand that the thing they thought was ordinary is not ordinary at all. Brock had his radio out. The young mother 2 tables over stood up slowly, pulling her daughter toward her chest, looking at Wesley with wide eyes. Howard was already standing. "What do you need?" he asked Wesley. "Help me get everyone out." Calmly. "Don't run. Don't crowd the door." Howard turned to the cafe without being asked. "All right, folks," he said, in the same flat prairie voice. "Time to step outside for a bit. Leave your things. Just walk out." People moved. People listened to Howard the way they listen to someone who sounds like they know what calm is supposed to sound like. Wesley stayed where he was. Brock stayed near the door, still on his radio, his face now carrying a different expression than it had 8 minutes ago. Glenn stood frozen behind the counter. "Glenn," Wesley said, "outside." Now moved. Kodak sat exactly where he was. They cleared the cafe in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Wesley was the last one out. He paused at the door and looked back at Kodak. "Come," he said. Kodak came. He walked out through the door and sat beside Wesley on the sidewalk and looked up at him once, briefly, and then looked back at the cafe. The EOD team arrived from CFB Borden in 51 minutes. They were professional and efficient, and they didn't waste time. The device they found inside the black canvas bag was real. It was not sophisticated, but it was real, and it was functional, and the cafe held 53 people at capacity. Wesley answered questions for 2 hours. He was patient. He was thorough. He didn't embellish. Kodak sat beside him and waited. There are things people say after something like this. They say it couldn't be real. They say the dog must have been reacting to something else. They need to reduce it to a coincidence, to a fluke, to the ordinary explanation that keeps the world manageable. But Howard didn't say any of that. Howard had grown up on a farm outside of Lethbridge, and he understood that some creatures simply know things that humans have spent centuries learning to ignore. He found Wesley standing by his truck in the parking lot afterward, Kodak sitting at his feet, both of them quiet in the way that people and animals are quiet after something large has moved through. Howard walked over. He didn't offer a hand. He just stood beside him for a moment. 22 years I've been coming to that cafe," Howard said finally. "Every Tuesday. Same table." Wesley nodded. "Patricia's going to want to thank you. Thank Kodak." Howard looked down at the dog. Kodak looked back at him with amber eyes that were patient and warm and held none of the afternoon's urgency anymore. "Can I pet him?" "Go ahead." Howard crouched down, slowly, the way men in their 70s crouch, and held out a hand. Kodak sniffed it once, and then allowed the ear scratch with the dignified grace of a creature that has earned the right to decide who gets close. Howard straightened up. He looked at Wesley. "What's his name?" "Kodak." Howard nodded slowly, like the name made perfect sense. "Good name. He's a good dog." They stood there a minute longer. The EOD team was loading equipment across the parking lot. Brock was talking to a supervisor. Glenn was sitting on the curb with his jacket wrapped around himself, looking at the pavement with the expression of a man doing a very quiet accounting of his choices. Wesley watched him for a moment, not with satisfaction, not with anger, just with the stillness of someone who has learned that most of the people who make your life harder aren't malicious. They're just small in ways they can't see yet. Maybe Glenn would see it now. Maybe he wouldn't. That wasn't Wesley's work to do. Patricia Holt arrived at noon. She drove a 12-year-old Subaru, and she parked it at an angle, and she got out moving fast, the way people move when they've been called with news that makes the distance between you and the place you love feel unbearable. She was 61, small, iron-gray hair, and the hands of someone who has kneaded a lot of dough and solved a lot of problems. She looked at the police tape, and the EOD truck, and the cluster of people on the sidewalk, and then she looked around until she found Wesley. She walked straight to him. She didn't say anything for a moment. She looked at him, and she looked at Kodak, and her eyes were bright. "You stayed," she said. "I was finishing my coffee." She laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that comes before the tears, and she reached down and put both hands on either side of Kodak's face and looked at him very seriously. "Thank you," she said to the dog. Kodak held very still and allowed it. Patricia stood up. She looked at Wesley. "Your breakfast is on the house. And every breakfast after that, for as long as you want it. You don't have to do that. I know I don't." She looked at him steadily. "Come back tomorrow. I'll have the cafe open again by 8. And I'll make sure there's something for Kodak, too." Wesley nodded once. She went to find Brock, and then the investigators, and then presumably Glenn. Though from the look on her face as she scanned the parking lot and found him still sitting on the curb, that particular conversation was going to take a different tone than the others. By 2 in the afternoon, the street had mostly returned to itself. Wesley sat on the tailgate of his truck with Kodak beside him. He had a gas station coffee that was terrible and a gas station sandwich that was worse. Kodak had half a protein bar and looked deeply unbothered by this. Across the street, Maple Run Café sat quiet behind its yellow tape, but not permanently quiet. The kind of quiet that precedes opening again. The kind that means something was saved. Wesley thought about the morning. He thought about the cold coming through the door, and the coffee that tasted like someone cared, and Kodak's nose twitching under the table. Most people spent their lives hoping they'd know what to do when something real happened. Kodak just knew. Wesley reached over and put his hand on the dog's back. Kodak leaned into it slightly. Not enough that you'd call it needy. Just enough that you'd call it honest. They sat like that for a while. The afternoon light was doing what October light does in Ontario, going gold and flat and sideways through the maples. Somewhere down the street, a kid on a bicycle cut through the crosswalk without stopping. The world kept going, as it does, as it should. And this narrator has only one thing left to say about the man in the back booth, the one who came in looking for coffee and quiet and nothing more. He found something else instead, something he'd always carried, and something that sat beside him with amber eyes and never once doubted what it knew. Some truths don't need a badge or a title or anyone's permission. They just need a nose that works, and someone steady enough to listen.